सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The 39th anniversary of Indira Gandhi's assassination has just passed by, which means this is now the 40th year since she died. And yet, her shadow, her image, her impression, and her influence, it hangs heavy on India's political scene. So, while the BJP also, 10th year of Narendra Modi, they might have been able to make people forget a lot about Rajiv Gandhi, but Indira Gandhi, it isn't quite so easy. In fact, we can see very often that Prime Minister Narendra Modi also picks up many of his ideas from Mrs. Indira Gandhi's playbook. So you see these ideas on the bureaucracy. She believed in a committed bureaucracy. You see some of these ideas on the judiciary. Also, citizens' rights. Remember, in our constitution, she, in the same year that she put in those two words, secularism and socialism, in the preamble of the constitution through an illegitimate parliament in its 6th year, in the same year, in the same amendment, she also added fundamental duties of the citizen. And Prime Minister Modi has made a big deal of fundamental duties, also his government. So that said, Indira Gandhi is a present factor. She is not a factor of the past. And we are dedicating this episode of Cut the Clutter to something that happened in her life, a change that happened in her life and which influences our thinking now, and which is also very important to think about going ahead as her grandson now, Rahul Gandhi, is shifting. It looks like he's swerving very hard to the left. Now, I know that we do occasionally, very occasionally, we take a break from the usual run of Cut the Clutter, which is the day's most prominent news, and we try and simplify that for you, but very occasionally we take a break and do some storytelling. Now, how often should we do it? That's a matter of judgment. It's a judgment call. Now, I see your responses. Many of you say we should do it more often. I am, however, more conservative. I do it only very occasionally. So this is one of those days. The moment I noticed that Mrs. Gandhi's 39th death anniversary or anniversary of the assassination is just passed and looks like nobody has paid much attention to it. This is the 40th year. I thought it is time for me to do a little bit of storytelling and also give you a little political lesson from her life, which is very relevant today. Because remember, politics is a long-term game. It is not a T20 match. It's actually like one of those never-ending test matches, right? If you played one of those test matches in the Sri Lankan wickets of the past, you could play on for 10 days and still the game would go on. So politics is a bit like that, not as boring as a 10-day test match in Sri Lanka that might end in a draw in the past, not like that. Politics is a continuing game. One leads to the other. So just as the mutual funds say, past is not a guide to future performance in politics and governance. It's exactly the opposite. The past is a guide not just to the future, but it also explains the present. Because in politics, the past never disappears. That's why an occasional round of storytelling is called for. So as we enter the 40th year of Indira Gandhi's assassination, we are now looking at one aspect of her life and her politics, which is not widely acknowledged. Everybody knows, it's accepted wisdom that the Indira Gandhi years were the pinkest in India's economic history. Also, that her second phase, which is at the peak of her glory in the post-71, 1971, till the post-emergency fall in 1977. Her peak glory year was after the Bangladesh victory in December 1971, and the fall was in 1977. This period, 1971 to 77, was the most deeply socialist of her three phases. And which were her three phases? The first being 1966 to 71, the second 1971 to 77, and the third 1980 to 1984, which ended unfortunately with her assassination. Some of India's worst economic laws were enacted by her largely illegitimate parliament during the emergency, as we just mentioned to you. The beginning of the 40th year of her assassination would probably have passed less eventfully, and I would have also taken less of a notice of it if the formality of the usual official ceremony had generally not more or less faded away. We know that in 2014, Modi government started observing on the same day Sardar Patel's birth anniversary, 30th October. That happened in Delhi as well, New Delhi as well, and traffic in central Delhi was blocked with lots of events taking place, not to observe Indira Gandhi's death anniversary, but to observe Sardar Patel's birth anniversary. That has got precedence in today's politics. So usually I might even have forgotten, but because yesterday I noticed coming to work that traffic was blocked, and why is it blocked? That's because several events are taking place to observe Sardar Patel's birth anniversary. Oh, isn't it also Indira Gandhi's death anniversary? And that's what alerted me to the idea. Now, I had written something about this, and it was a national interest article in 2014, and I will share a link with you. You can read that article. In fact, you might remember that my political columns, national interest, my weekly column has now been on for almost 28 years, right? It's been going on for a long time. So a selection of my political columns of the period leading up to the rise of Narendra Modi, that was published in my earlier collection called Anticipating India. This was published in the summer of 2014. Now we are in the process of compiling a selection from the last 10 years, the 10 Modi years. If you think you can think of a title, I'm still figuring out what the title of the book should be. If you think of a title, please do let me know. So it is in this period of 10 years that I wrote this column on Indira Gandhi also. And this column was about Indira Gandhi's rethink on economic policy and the controversy over 3rd October, whether it should be observed as Indira Gandhi's death anniversary or should Sardar Patel's birth anniversary take precedence. That's a function of politics of the day. India now has its government of the most unapologetic right on in its second term. So you can imagine these changes taking place. But these changes alerted me to also talk about this issue, Indira Gandhi's shift. In fact, sparks like these are needed to reignite debates on the years of our most significant prime minister so far. Now, I know I say it with caution because many would argue that no, she was not our most significant prime minister so far. Maybe it was Narendra Modi. Some might even say it was Jawaharlal Nehru. I would still say its opinion. I would still say that so far she's been our most significant prime minister. She was also in power for longer. Mr. Modi has some distance to go. Nevertheless, much of the stuff on her politics, creative destruction of the Congress and the emergency, her iron will and patriotism is familiar to most Indians. Fresh, intriguing, and sometimes pleasant surprises, however, emerged on how her economic thinking evolved over these years. As you would expect, T.N. Nayanan, our most formidable commentator in economy and business and my executive editor at India Today between 1985 and 88, he had initiated this with a provocative column. He writes a weekly column, Weekend Ruminations, which we also publish simultaneously on The Print, just as Business Standard simultaneously publishes National Interest. He wrote a provocative column a few days before Mrs. Gandhi's anniversary then, and he said intriguingly that far from reinforcing her socialist drive, Indira Gandhi at the peak of her power had actually begun to loosen things up, or at least start some review and introspection by the end of 1974, a year before the emergency. Now that is something that we don't think about very much. When we think Indira Gandhi, we think deep socialism, deep pink political economy. Briefly, Nayanan's thesis was that by 1974, India was in deep economic distress, inflation was running high. How high, I will tell you in a minute. There was widespread popular disenchantment, and Indira made her most significant political blunder yet. Guess what it was? Under pressure from her Darbari leftist cabal, DP Dhar, PN Aksar, etc., she nationalized grain trade, and that too in a crisis year for agriculture. Why did she do so? Because these advisors and supposedly wise men of that era, they said if the Soviet Union can do it, why can't India? So their view of life was that everything Soviet Union was doing was right, everything the Western world, the American world in particular was doing was wrong. So we should we should learn from the Soviets and do anything they were doing. That's why they said Indira Gandhi's government should also nationalize grain trade. And that became her biggest blunder. It caused such anger among farmers that for the first time in her prime ministership, she was forced to withdraw a major decision. This set in motion the process of review and rethink. This was strengthened by two personalities, the one in departure and the other in arrival. What was the departure? In 1973, an Indian Airlines crash in New Delhi took away her steel and mines minister and her most leftist cabinet comrade. Mohan Kumaramangalam was a former Communist Party member who had learned as much ideology at King's College, Cambridge as law. The departure of Kumaramangalam coincided with the rise of Sanjay Gandhi, who, at least on his view of business and economy, was Kumaramangalam's exact opposite, even if you would not describe him as a libertarian in any other manner whatsoever. We journalists are not historians, scholars, or astrologers. Our skills are generally limited to faithfully observing and chronicling the present, not searching the past or predicting the future. Let's pass astrology for now. Let me not do that. Let me not go there. But thankfully, we still have wonderful historians whose work we can rely on. You can find a great deal of wisdom and insight, for example, in Srinath Raghavan's brilliant essay on Indira Gandhi in Makers of Modern Asia, edited by Ramchandra Guha. Raghavan says, Indira's socialist phase, Srinath Raghavan says, Indira's socialist phase continued till 1973. Just what Nayanan marked in his article. But this momentum was broken by a crisis inevitable in a post-war populist economy. War in this case is the 1971 Bangladesh War. Monsoon failures and the 1973 oil shock after the Yom Kippur War, Srinath Raghavan reminds us, had taken our inflation rate to 33%. 33%, you heard it right, 3 and 3, 33%, there is no decimal in the middle. 33% by late 1974. This also fueled the JP movement. Indira first resorted to a tough anti-inflation squeeze. She thought that'll work, never mind the warnings of her left ideologues that these would annoy people. She preferred, Raghavan tells us, the advice of the more liberal economic advisors. More liberal is a relative description for that period. This group of more liberal or less illiberal economic advisors was led by that virtuous usual suspect, Dr. Manmohan Singh. She also approached the IMF for a $935 million loan. It was a lot of money then, almost $1 billion, a lot of money in mid-70s, early mid-70s. This was a bailout. She quietly allowed the rupee to depreciate, thereby improving India's exports and foreign exchange reserves. Raghavan argues in his essay that 1973-1974 marked an important turning point in her economic policy, one that remains underappreciated. The shift, he says, was attitudinal more than substantive, but it brought growth. During 1975-78, India grew at 6% per year. 6%. That is something we don't remember very much now. 1975-78, 6% per year. 2 of these years were during the emergency. This was twice the fabled Hindu rate of growth. Srinath Raghavan quotes extensively from a fascinating exchange of letters between Indira Gandhi and her close advisor and cousin B.K. Nehru. B.K. Nehru's views on economics seemed more liberal than on individual liberty. Why? Because B.K. Nehru had hailed the emergency as a tour de force, I'm quoting exactly, tour de force of immense courage. Now he was telling her to replace Garibi Hatao with Utpadan Badhao. Increase production. Some of Nehru's lines are stunningly prescient. This is B.K. Nehru, not Jawaharlal Nehru. Some of B.K. Nehru's lines are stunningly prescient. And we have been repeating the same thought, even if not so succinctly, during Sonia Gandhi's Povertarian UPA 2 as well. In fact, I might have repeated it many times. Raghavan quotes a December 1974 letter from an irritable Indira Gandhi reminding B.K. Nehru, that under present conditions, and I'm quoting, under present conditions, there can be no economic growth which ignores social justice. Sound familiar? Nehru, the cousin, bravely joins the battle of ideas by asking whether, and I again quote, social justice means equality in poverty or growth in the size of the national cake, which may continue to be divided in unequal portions if necessary. And I close quotes here. He goes on to argue that, quotes again, he goes on to argue that all other objectives should be subordinated to this one objective of increasing production, quotes closed. This isn't much different from an oft-repeated lament of equal distribution of poverty by my economist friend Surjit Bhalla, who P. Chidambaram once described as being way to the right of Adam Smith, and which led me to the discovery of the trademarked term povertarianism. But if one air crash had broken the socialist momentum, another intervened to disrupt her reformist phase as Sanjay died in his aerobatic plane so early in her new term, that is June 23, 1980. Indira did lose her will and spirit to a great extent and was never the same again. Her intellectual shift, however, continued. I have it on the authority of several key officers and advisors who watched her closely then, including foreign service giants like Jagat Mehta and J.N. Dikshit, that she felt rotten at the position India was forced to take on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. She felt humiliated that some of the speeches by our envoys at the UN sounded more grating than those of the Cubans. This is very relevant right now when there is an argument about Modi government's abstention on the Gaza-Israel resolution at the UN General Assembly. She also probably had the sense that the Cold War was going to end and India couldn't afford to end up being totally on the loser's side. There is evidence that she had begun course correction on foreign policy as well. In the 1981 multilateral summit at Cancun, Mexico, I believe, she sought out Ronald Reagan. This was to be her first contact with the US at a high level after her disastrous time with Nixon. The following year, she visited Washington, and the process of mending relations with the US was well and truly underway. She seems to have realized that in the new global strategic and economic order after the Cold War, India could not carry on being at odds with the West all the time. By 1983, however, India's internal security situation had deteriorated badly and left little scope for further economic action. Nellie massacre, early 1983, February 1983, and other massacres happened in Assam. By this time, Bhindranwale had risen, guns and all, AK-47s and all, in Punjab as well. What followed until her assassination 4 decades ago is relatively better known, more recent history. She has been deservedly given a place in history as a great patriot and a martyr, a champion of India's integrity and sovereignty. So my question in conclusion, could it be? Could it be that we have not yet fully appreciated her intellect and prescience on economic and foreign policies? As I conclude this, let me also tell you a story because I told you it's a storytelling day. And it's like a postscript. While I was a full-time wage-paid reporter, 1977 onwards, I was too junior to get much opportunity to observe Indira Gandhi closely or to interact with her. My first 10-minute conversation with her was printed in the Indian Express in 1979, and that took place as I buttonholed her during a transit stop in Chandigarh at Chandigarh Airport en route to Srinagar. Those were the days when Indian Airlines had only one flight that went Delhi, Chandigarh, Jammu, Srinagar. It was like a hopping flight, if I remember correctly, IC421, something like that. She was out of power then. Out of power politicians are more accessible, and because she was out of power, she probably had the patience for a persistent little reporter. It was in fact a rare moment from that past which was recorded by camera, and I have a picture for which I have to thank Swadesh Talbar, my colleague then at the Indian Express. See that picture on your screens. I saw her up close again in somewhat different circumstances 4 years later as she came to Nellie a day after the great massacres, the horrible massacres that left more than 3,000 Muslims dead. There was fury writ large on her face. Her helicopter had kicked up enormous amounts of dust in dry floodplains of the Brahmaputra. So there was a lot of dust. It was falling into her eyes, getting into all her nostrils. And she said in anger, "Kitna dhula udta hai?" How awfully dusty it is. She said several times as she walked out of the helicopter, its rotors hardly fully stationary yet. But her anger was not over the clouds of dust, as we soon saw. She first looked daggers at KPS Gill, who was then IG Police, IGP Law and Order in Assam, as if he were some delinquent neighbor, and asked, "Kab tak jalta rahega yahan? Until when will this place burn?" Only Gill could have the nerve to deal with that. And he said, Let elections be over, madam, then we will bring it to normal. This conversation and incident is quoted in my 1983 book, Assam a Valley Divided. Indira Gandhi ignored him and walked ahead. She looked at the carnage, hundreds of bodies, fresh graves, the wounded. I do not believe I detected a tear in her eye, just plain anger. As she turned around, the cowering figure of R.V. Subramanian, who ran the state under President's rule as chief advisor to the governor, and she said to him, and I quote again, 3,000 मुसलमान मारे गए, कौन जवाब देगा इनको? I remember she said इनको and not इसका. कौन जवाब देगा इसका? Because that would be a moral question. The second is a political question. Let me try and explain it. The first question would have been, who was guilty? Who was to blame for this? She wasn't asking that. That would have been the moral question. The second, the political question was, how will we answer the Muslim minority? By this time, I saw her eyes turn moist. She put on her sunglasses. She didn't want to be photographed, obviously, with moist eyes. She repeated the same question to a speechless Subramanian, turned and trudged back in her Mi-8 helicopter. Never mind the dust, its rotors had already begun to churn. One thing I can tell you for sure, she would have been even more furious at the anti-Sikh carnage that followed her assassination. Because remember, despite warnings from her security officers, senior-most security officers, take Sikhs from Delhi police off her security detail, she had insisted on not doing so.